Somewhere past the last marked trail, the map runs out. That's where we live. Out here, there's an old saying. What sees you first follows you longest. So here's the deal. Subscribe and hit that like button, or you're walking back alone. We're chasing 10,000 souls by the end of 2026. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. I spent 15 years working search and rescue in the mountains. 15 years of frozen boots and dead radio batteries and the particular kind of silence that falls over a search party right before someone finds a body, or worse, doesn't find anything at all. For most of that time, I believed exactly what everyone else believed. People get lost. People make one bad decision in good weather, or 3 bad decisions in a storm, and the mountain keeps them. I clung to that belief because it let me sleep at night. It let me look a mother in the eye and promise her we were bringing her son home, and mean it because 90% of the time, we did. But there were 6 cases in 15 years that nobody ever officially told me to keep quiet about. It was quieter than that. A hand on my shoulder at the right moment. A sheriff saying, "Let's keep this one simple for the family," and me nodding along because I was tired, and because arguing never seemed to change anything that mattered. 6 people vanished in places where vanishing should not have been possible. And every single time, without exception, we found the same 3 things waiting for us. Tracks that belonged to nothing living in that forest. Calls for help coming from land that had been empty for years. And something standing just past the tree line, patient as a held breath, watching us search for whoever it had already taken. I'm retired now. I live alone, out past the edge of a town small enough that the hardware store closes for lunch and nobody complains about it. My days are quiet in a way I used to think I wanted. I split firewood I don't strictly need. I walk the same half-mile of gravel road every morning and turn around at the same bent fence post every time, because some habits from 15 years of tracking people never really leave you, and part of me is always measuring distance without meaning to. I want to tell you about the days just before the box arrived too, because looking back now, I don't think they were as ordinary as I believed at the time. For almost a week beforehand, the dog next door, a normally quiet old hound who never so much as lifted his head at passing cars, wouldn't stop pacing the fence line closest to the tree line behind my property, low growls rattling in his chest at nothing I could see. My neighbour mentioned it to me twice in passing, laughing it off both times, blaming a stray cat or a raccoon nesting somewhere in his crawl space. I laughed along with him both times too. I've had a long time to think about why that particular detail stuck with me the way it did, and I think some part of me, some old buried instinct, from 15 years of reading the small signs animals give you before people notice anything at all, already knew something was circling closer even before that box ever showed up. 2 weeks ago, a cardboard box showed up on my porch with no return address on it anywhere. Inside was a stack of my own old case files, the actual pages, the actual handwriting, my handwriting, from a job I left behind a long time ago. That part shouldn't be possible on its own because I burned most of those files myself the year I quit. Standing over a rusted barrel behind my old house, watching the smoke curl up into a sky that felt like it was watching me back. I stood on my porch for a long time that afternoon, just holding that box, not opening it, listening to the wind move through trees that had no business sounding the way they sounded that day. Eventually I brought it inside. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because everything I'm about to say started with that box sitting on my kitchen table, and it hasn't really stopped since. So, I'm going to tell you what actually happened, from the beginning, the way it actually happened. Not the version that went into any official report. Not the version Sheriff Bale typed up with that same tired phrase every single time, the real one. What you do with it afterward is entirely up to you. I should tell you first that I loved that job. Before any of this, in the plain, uncomplicated way, you love something that asks everything of you and gives you a reason to get up before sunrise anyway. My third year on the team, we found a retired schoolteacher named Dot, who had wandered off a marked trail chasing what she later told us was a butterfly she was certain her late husband had sent her. We found her 2 ridges over, dehydrated and sunburned but alive, sitting calmly against the boulder like she'd simply been waiting for us the whole time. I carried her out myself, and she thanked me the way people do when they've decided you personally saved their life. And I drove home that night feeling like I had finally found the one thing I was built to do. I want you to hold on to that feeling while you listen to the rest of this, because it's the same feeling I carried with me into every single one of the 6 cases that came after, and it's the feeling that made it so much harder later to accept what I was actually looking at. Before I get into my own cases, I want you to know I wasn't the first person to ever notice this shape to things, and I won't be the last. There's a body of research out there put together over years by a former police detective who started digging through national park records after an off-duty ranger told him something felt wrong, something nobody wanted to say out loud in daylight. He ended up cataloguing hundreds of cases going back decades, and the same pattern kept surfacing, no matter how far apart in time or geography the cases were. People vanishing within shouting distance of their own families, no scream, no sound, nothing at all, like the air itself just closed over them. Search dogs reaching the last known point of a trail and simply stopping, sitting down, whining low in their throats, refusing to go one step further no matter how hard their handlers pushed or pleaded. Victims turning up later in places that made no sense whatsoever. The wrong side of a ridge, an elevation nobody could have climbed in the time they'd been missing. Sometimes with their clothing gone entirely, sometimes folded with a strange, deliberate neatness in a spot they never should have paused long enough to fold anything. Children found alive days later, hungry but never starved, dazed, unable to say where they had been or how they had gotten there, like somebody had reached into the timeline of their own memory and lifted a piece clean out of it, leaving the edges stitched together just a little bit wrong. I didn't know any of that research existed until years into my own career. Mara found it. She read everything she could get her hands on after our second strange case, staying up long past when either of us should have still been awake, because she needed proof she wasn't losing her mind. Needed to know somebody else out there had stood where we'd stood and come away asking the same impossible questions. When she finally laid those records out for me one night at her kitchen table, papers spread edge to edge under a single lamp, I remember feeling relief and horror in almost exactly equal measure, because it meant we weren't the only search and rescue team in the country who had ever stood in a clearing at the end of a long bad night and known, without being able to prove a single thing to anyone who mattered, that something else had gotten there first. My name is Cal Veyron. For most of my working life, I led a mountain search and rescue team out of a small station that served 3 counties and more wilderness than any of us could properly patrol. Mara Kessler was our medic, and she had a gift for reading an injury the way some people read a face. Could look at a scraped knuckle or a bruised heel and tell you almost exactly what a person had gone through to survive, as long as they had. She'd joined the team after losing a cousin to a fall nobody could have prevented, and she carried that loss quietly in the careful, thorough way she treated every single patient, like they were the only one who mattered that day. Dax Holloran was our tracker, a former wildlife researcher who had spent 2 decades studying animal movement before he came over to us, and who could look at a print in the mud and tell you not just the species but the animal's likely age, its gait, whether it was favouring a leg. That expertise made it so much worse later when he started finding prints that fit no species he had ever studied in his entire career. Eli Corbin ran our radio at base camp on nearly every call we ever took. A quiet, careful man who had a habit of recording every transmission that came through, not out of any procedure, just out of a nervous, private instinct that turned out to matter more than any of us could have guessed. And working alongside us, more often than ever, felt entirely comfortable, was a county sheriff named Rowan Bale, a heavy-set, unhurried man with an uncanny gift for arriving at a scene faster than any radio call should have physically allowed, given the roads out there, and who always seemed to already know more than he was willing to say. Mara used to say she could tell more about what happened to a person from the soles of their feet than from anything they told her once they could talk again. She kept a small notebook separate from any official file, where she wrote down the small human details of every rescue, what somebody said when they first saw daylight, what they asked for first, water or a phone or their mother. She told me once that the notebook was the only part of the job that felt like it belonged to her instead of to the county. And later, when everything went wrong, that same instinct, the need to keep her own private record of the truth, was exactly what saved the parts of this story that would otherwise have disappeared into a filing cabinet forever. Dax had come to us almost by accident. He'd spent 2 decades studying elk migration for a state wildlife agency before budget cuts ended that career, and he joked in the beginning that tracking lost hikers was just tracking a slower, dumber animal that occasionally screamed for help. He kept a laminated card in his pack with sketches of every track he might reasonably expect to find in our part of the country: deer, elk, bear, cougar, coyote, bobcat, each one labelled in his own neat handwriting. He was proud of that card. He used to say a man who couldn't identify what he was looking at had no business being out in the woods at all. I think about that card sometimes now, and about how, after Fallow Creek, he never took it out of his pack again. Not once, because he told me privately there was no point carrying a reference for things you already knew weren't on it. Eli was the quietest of us, happiest sitting alone at base with his radio and his headphones, and he had a habit, going back to before any of us knew him, of recording every transmission that passed through his station, storing the tapes in neat rows on a shelf in his spare room labelled by date. He told me once it started as a way to catch his own mistakes, so he could go back and listen to himself and get better at his job. None of us had any idea in those early years how much that simple, careful habit would end up mattering. And then there was Sheriff Bale, who had held that badge longer than anyone could quite remember, longer, some of the older folks in town liked to joke, than seemed strictly possible, given how little the man appeared to age. He knew every back road and every family in 3 counties, and for years I chalked up his uncanny timing to nothing more than decades of experience and a small enough county that word travelled fast. I did not yet have any reason to think otherwise. For the first several years of my career, none of this darkness had touched us yet. We handled the ordinary tragedies of the mountains, the kind that make sense even when they break your heart. A hiker with a broken ankle 3 miles past where he should have turned back. An elderly man who wandered from a cabin in the fog and was found, cold but breathing, curled against a boulder the next morning. I want you to know we were good at our jobs. We were not the kind of team that panicked, or told stories around a fire to scare each other, or believed in things that couldn't be measured and mapped and explained. That mattered, because everything that came later happened to people who did not want to believe it, who fought against believing it for as long as we possibly could. The first case that cracked something open in all of us involved a camper named Holt Bramwell. He had gone out alone to a site along Fallow Creek, a spot popular enough that there was rarely a full season without at least 1 or 2 overnight groups camped along its banks. He missed his scheduled check-in call on a cool evening in early autumn, and by the time we reached his site the next morning, mist still clinging low to the water, we found the whole clearing wrong in a way none of us could name right away. The birds that should have been loud in that kind of thick morning mist along a creek bed weren't calling at all. Dax noticed it before any of the rest of us said a word, stopping mid-stride to look around at the silent trees and I remember him saying quietly that a healthy creek bottom like that should have been full of noise this time of morning, and that the quiet felt less like an absence of sound and more like something actively holding its breath around us. His tent was still standing, exactly as he must have left it the night before. Nothing knocked over, nothing dragged through the dirt. His boots were even lined up neatly outside the tent flap, the way a careful camper leaves them so they don't track mud inside. What we found instead of any sign of struggle was his phone, propped with obvious deliberate care against a flat rock near the fire pit, angled towards the dead ashes, still recording, the battery somehow not yet drained after a full night alone in the cold. We watched that footage together back at base that same evening, 4 of us crowded around a small screen in a cold, fluorescent lit room. Nobody speaking, nobody even shifting in their chairs. The fire in the recording burned low and orange. You could hear Holt humming to himself somewhere, just off camera, some tune none of us recognized, a little off key, the kind of thing a person hums when they think nobody else can hear. And then, right at the very edge of the firelight, something started to move, low to the ground at first, almost animal in the way it carried itself, circling the tent at a distance that never quite let the camera catch it cleanly, always just at the edge of focus, always just behind a tree trunk or a shadow. Then, for exactly one single frame, one frozen instant that Eli would later play back for us dozens of times in a row until none of us could stand to watch it again, it rose up onto 2 legs, tall, far too tall for anything that should have been circling a campsite in the dark, and the recording ended right there, not with static, not with a scream, just ended. The way a light switches off the moment somebody decides they are finished looking at whatever it was illuminating. Dax went back out at first light the next morning to examine the ground where that shape would have been standing. He came back to the truck pale in a way I had genuinely never seen on him before. Not even on our worst calls, not even the time we pulled a child's body from beneath river ice 2 winters earlier. He told me the first few prints looked almost human. A heel, an arch, close enough at a glance that you might convince yourself a barefoot man had wandered through in the middle of the night. Then the toes fanned out into 6 blunt points instead of 5, and the distance between one print and the next nearly doubled by the time the trail reached the tree line, as if whatever made them had simply grown tired of pretending to walk the way we do and had stopped bothering with the disguise altogether. He said something to me that morning that stayed lodged in my chest for the rest of my career. The kind of sentence you carry around for years without ever quite putting down. 20 years, he said, staring at his own boots. 20 years I've spent studying how animals move for a living, Cal. And whatever made these prints was not an animal. Not in any sense of the word I've ever understood it. Sheriff Bale arrived at that campsite less than an hour after we radioed it in, which should have been flatly impossible given how rough and washed out the roads got that far from town, especially with the previous week's rain. He looked at the tent for maybe 10 seconds. He glanced at the fire pit for even less than that. Then he told me, in the same flat, unhurried voice he used for everything, to log it as a camper, lost to exposure, case closed, before I had written a single line in my own notebook. I stood there in the cold, holding a blank page, watching him fill out paperwork that already had that exact phrase typed onto it in advance, like it had been prepared before he'd ever left his office that morning, before anyone had told him a single detail about what we'd found. That was the same night, driving back to base in the dark with the heater rattling, and neither of us saying much, that Mara finally told me her secret, the one she'd apparently been keeping since our very first strange case together, months before Holt Bramwell had ever pitched his tent along that creek. She'd been quietly photocopying every report before Bale ever got the chance to soften it, or shorten it, or rewrite it outright, keeping the true copies locked away in a small steel box at her cabin, hidden beneath a floorboard. She'd pried up herself one weekend with a crowbar. Somewhere along the way, she told me, staring out the passenger window at the dark trees sliding past. She had stopped trusting that the official version of any of this would ever match what we had actually seen with our own two eyes. And she wasn't willing to let that gap disappear without a record of it existing somewhere. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that case. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to understanding everything that came after. I would wake up at strange hours, convinced I had heard something moving just outside my bedroom window, some low, dragging sound that never repeated itself long enough for me to be sure I hadn't imagined it. I told myself it was stress. I told myself a lot of things that autumn that I no longer entirely believe. About a month after Fallow Creek, Eli called me at home one night, later than any of us usually called each other, and asked if I could come by his place. He met me at the door without saying much, and led me back to the little room where he kept his radio equipment. Shelves of labelled tapes lining the walls like a small, quiet library. He'd been going back through old transmissions from calls, going back years before Holt Bramwell, he told me, ever since that footage had gotten under his skin, just listening late at night when he couldn't sleep either. He played me 3 different recordings from 3 separate searches, years apart, involving 3 different missing persons who had all eventually been found alive and returned safely to their families with no further incident. In each recording, buried under wind noise and static, right at the edge of what the equipment could pick up, there was a low, rhythmic sound moving through the background of the transmission, almost like breathing, almost like something pacing. He'd never noticed it before, he said, because he'd never had a reason to go looking for it. Now that he knew what he was listening for, he couldn't find a single old tape from a search in that part of the county that didn't have it somewhere in the background, faint but unmistakable, once you knew it was there. Neither of us said much else that night. I drove home a little after midnight with every window in my truck rolled up despite the mild weather, watching the tree line the entire way. The second case belonged to a little girl named Wren Ashcombe, 8 years old, missing a front tooth, the kind of kid who apparently narrated everything she did out loud to nobody in particular. She wandered off from a family campground on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon that nobody remembers clearly until it becomes the day everything in a family changes forever. We searched 3 full days without a single solid lead. The dogs could not hold a scent trail longer than a few hundred feet before they would stop cold, sit down in the dirt, and refuse to move another inch no matter how hard their handlers coaxed or pushed them forward. One handler told me, off to the side, voice low so the family wouldn't hear, that his dog had never once refused a trail like that in 11 years of working together, and that the animal wouldn't even look toward the ridge afterward, kept its head turned deliberately away from it the entire drive home. Those 3 days blur together now, in the way exhaustion makes everything blur, but pieces of them still surface at odd hours. The second night, deep past midnight, one of the volunteer searchers, a young man who worked at the feed store in town, swore he heard a child laughing somewhere off in the dark timber, close, maybe 50 feet off the trail, and he told us he'd started walking toward it before Dax grabbed his arm and pulled him back, telling him flatly that no child laughs like that alone in the woods at that hour. Not once. Not ever. The young man didn't argue. He just went quiet and stayed close to the group for the rest of the night. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mara found a single small footprint pressed into soft mud near a dry creek bed, bare, the right size for an 8-year-old girl. And beside it, close enough to have been made in the same instant, a second print far too large to belong to anything human, 5 long, narrow toes splayed unnaturally wide, as though something had been crouched directly beside Wren, matching her pace for however long that single stretch of muddy ground had recorded the 2 of them walking together. We never told her mother about that second print. Some things, I decided a long time ago, are kinda left in a file nobody reads. On the morning of the 4th day, she simply walked out of the tree line on her own, unharmed, wearing the same clothes she had vanished in 3 nights earlier, not torn, not filthy in the way you would expect after that many nights alone outdoors in cooling autumn weather. She would not speak English. Instead, she hummed this strange, looping little rhythm that repeated itself in a pattern none of us could quite hold on to once it stopped, and when she did produce actual words, they came out as a string of unfamiliar syllables that made both of our search dogs back away from her immediately and refuse to come near, whining low in their throats like they had caught the scent of something none of the rest of us could smell in the air around her. Mara examined her right there in the field, gentle and quick, the way she always was, with frightened children, and found no injuries anywhere on the girl's small body. Which should have been wonderful news, except her core temperature was several degrees lower than it had any right to be, for a child who had supposedly spent 3 cold nights alone outside with no shelter and no fire. Wren's mother pulled me aside afterward, well away from the sheriff, well away from everybody else milling around the campground with relieved, exhausted faces, and told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Wren kept repeating one particular phrase over and over, the same handful of strange sounds arranged in the same order every single time, and that it felt to her less like confusion and more like a warning her daughter was desperately trying and failing to translate into words she no longer had access to. She also told me Wren kept pointing up toward the ridge above the campground whenever she said it, small finger extended, utterly certain, saying something that sounded as close as her mother could manage to describe it to me standing there in the cold afternoon light like it's still counting the others. Sheriff Bale took the only recording Eli had made of Wren's voice that same evening and told the family the case was closing as a successful recovery, nothing further to discuss, and that the girl would likely return to normal speech within a few days as the shock wore off. What he didn't know, because Eli never told him, was that Eli had already made a second copy for himself on an old cassette, before ever handing over the original file. Around that same stretch of time, I started noticing something happening inside my own head that unsettled me far more than anything the girl had said. Late at night, alone in my own house, I would feel this faint but genuinely persistent pull to get up, get dressed and walk out toward that ridge in the dark. An urge I never once acted on, thank God, but an urge that felt, if I'm honest with you, like it belonged to someone else's mind entirely, like it had wandered into mine by accident one night and simply gotten lost there, unable to find its way back out. My wife at the time, a patient woman named Ivy, who had put up with more absences and more middle-of-the-night call-outs than any marriage should reasonably survive, noticed the change in me before I was willing to admit there was one to notice. She told me, a few weeks after Fallow Creek, that I'd started sleeping with the lamp on, something I'd never done in all our years together, and that I flinched now at sounds outside the house I would never have registered before. A branch against the siding, a car passing slow on the road out front. I told her it was nothing, that the job had just been rough lately, and she let it go because she'd learned over the years which of my silences were worth pushing against and which ones weren't. We separated 2 years later, not because of any single fight, just a slow accumulation of nights I couldn't fully be present for. Half my attention always turned toward a tree line only I seemed to be watching. I've never blamed her for that. I'm not certain, looking back now, that I could have explained to her what was actually happening to me, even if I had tried. And some nights I wonder if some small, protective part of me simply refused to let her get close enough to become part of any of this, the way the rest of us had. I mentioned it to Dax once, carefully over a beer, at the end of a long week, half expecting him to laugh it off. He didn't laugh. He just went very quiet and told me he'd been having something similar. Except in his case, it wasn't a pull toward the ridge. It was a persistent, nagging feeling that he was being watched every single time he stepped outside after dark, even standing in his own driveway, even just taking out the trash. He said it had started the week we found those six-toed prints at Fallow Creek and had never fully gone away since. The case that really broke everything wide open for all of us happened on Alder Ridge, and it folded 2 separate disappearances into one long, terrible week that none of us who lived through it ever fully recovered from. A married couple, Grant and Della Pruitt, experienced hikers, careful people, the kind who packed extra supplies without being asked and told friends exactly which trail they would be taking and precisely when to expect them back, vanished partway through what should have been a routine overnight hike along a well-marked section of the ridge. Della was a physical therapist and Grant taught high school shop class, and they'd been married long enough that their friends described them, almost every one of them separately, using the exact same word: steady. They had done this same hike 4 years running to mark their anniversary. Always the same weekend, always the same loop, and Della's sister told me over the phone, her voice cracking, that the two of them knew that ridge better than they knew their own backyard. I need to back up for a moment and tell you about the 2-person search team, because I've carried a private guilt about them for longer than I've been willing to admit out loud. Their names were Ruth and a young trainee named Colby, and they'd been sent out ahead of the rest of us on an unrelated call. A report of a possible injured hiker that turned out, we later suspected, to have never existed at all, phoned in from a number that was never traced to anyone. When they missed their check-in, we assumed radio trouble, which happened often enough in that terrain, not to alarm anyone right away. By the time we organised the search for our own searchers, 3 full days had passed. We found their truck exactly where they'd parked it, doors locked, keys still in Ruth's coat pocket sitting folded on the driver's seat, as if she'd taken it off deliberately, before walking away from the vehicle entirely. It was another 2 days after that before Dax found their gear stacked at the base of that tree, and I remember him going very still and very quiet, crouched there in the dirt, running his fingers along the edge of a pack strap that had been folded with a precision neither Ruth nor Colby, by every account of the people who knew them, would ever have bothered with themselves. We tracked their prints across nearly a mile of open ground, clean and clear in the soft dirt, the entire way, matching perfectly with the boot treads Della's sister had described to us over the phone. For most of that mile, the tracks looked exactly like what you'd expect from 2 people enjoying an easy morning walk, evenly spaced, unhurried, sometimes overlapping where they'd clearly been walking close together. Once, even pausing near a fallen log where the grass was flattened in a wide circle, as if they'd stopped to sit and rest for a while before moving on. Nothing about that first mile suggested anything had gone wrong. That was somehow the worst part of the whole search for me. Whatever happened to Grant and Della hadn't happened in a struggle or a chase. It had happened in the middle of an ordinary, peaceful morning, mid-conversation, mid-step, with no warning at all that either of them seemed to have noticed, and then, right in the centre of a wide, empty field with no tree cover anywhere near it, no water, nothing at all for hundreds of feet in any direction, the footprints simply stopped. No drag marks. No sign of a struggle anywhere in the surrounding grass. No second set of prints leading off toward the trees. Just 2 people's worth of tracks ending mid-stride, as clean and sudden as if something had reached down out of the sky and lifted them straight up off the ground without disturbing a single blade of grass around where they'd been standing. We set up camp that night at the edge of that same field, planning to resume the search again at first light, and none of us slept much, not with the memory of those stopped footprints still fresh in our minds. Sometime in the deep, black hours before dawn, long past when any of us should still have been awake, Eli picked up a distress call on the radio, and the voice on it was unmistakably Della's, calling out for help in a tone that made every hair on my arm stand up. Coming from a location that, according to every map we carried in the truck, was empty forest with no trail access whatsoever, nothing but dense timber for miles. Dax and I went out to check it while the rest of the team stayed put at camp with the radio, weapons ready, though none of us said out loud what we thought we might need them for. We found no one there. What we found instead were enormous prints circling the exact clearing that voice had seemed to originate from, pressed deep into the damp ground, each one showing 6 toes where there should have been 5, the same pattern from Fallow Creek but easily twice the size. And then, for the first and only time, on that entire trip we saw it directly, standing at the edge of the clearing in the grey pre-dawn light, a massive pale figure covered in short grey fur, standing upright, easily 2 heads taller than either of us, broad through the shoulders in a way that made my chest go tight just looking at it. It simply watched, unmoving. For almost a full minute, it stood there in complete silence, and I remember very clearly the specific horror of realizing it was not looking at the clearing, or at the trees, or at anything general. It was looking directly at me, and had been the entire time we'd been standing there, long before we ever noticed it was there to look. Then it stepped backward into the trees and was simply gone, faster than anything that size should ever have been physically capable of moving. Gone so completely and so quickly that for a full 10 seconds afterward, neither Dax nor I could convince ourselves we hadn't imagined the entire thing. Dax broke down that night in a way I had never seen from him before, and never saw again afterward, not even years later. He kept repeating over and over that it had been standing there long before we ever arrived at that clearing, that it had probably been watching our entire camp for hours in the dark while we slept 50 feet away, and none of us had noticed a single thing until the exact moment it had decided we should. Neither Ruth nor Colby were ever found, not that week, not in the months of follow-up searches that continued long after everyone else had quietly given up hope, and their families never got anything back except that carefully stacked gear and a folded coat that told us nothing at all about what had actually happened to either of them in their final moments. Sheriff Bale arrived again far too quickly once we called in the Pruitts, as officially lost, already carrying paperwork ruling their disappearance, a fall into a ravine that, according to his own notes, hadn't even been physically located by anyone on our team yet. I finally confronted him about it that night, standing in the cold outside his truck, asking him flat out how he always seemed to arrive before anyone had time to actually radio him in. He didn't answer directly. He just looked at me for a long moment, longer than felt remotely comfortable, his face unreadable in the dark, and told me I didn't want to know how long he'd actually been doing this particular job. Longer than I'd ever believe, he said quietly. And then he climbed into his truck and left it right there. And I stood alone in that cold field for a long time afterward, watching his taillights disappear down the mountain. It was almost a year later, though it feels strange now to describe anything in that stretch of my life as ordinary, that we took a call about a solo hunter named Walt Priddy, who had gone missing near the western edge of Alder Ridge during elk season. His truck was found parked exactly where he'd told his wife it would be. His rifle was found leaning neatly against a tree a half-mile in, unfired, safety still engaged, as though he had simply set it down to answer a question from someone standing beside him. His wife told us he'd hunted that same stretch of ridge for over 30 years, without so much as a twisted ankle, and that the last thing he'd said to her that morning, standing in the kitchen with his thermos in hand, was that he'd heard something calling the week before that didn't sound quite right to him, though he couldn't say why, and he wanted to go back out and get a proper look at whatever it was before the season ended. During the second day of that search, we heard what sounded at first like an elk call, echoing through the trees somewhere off to the north. except something about it was wrong in a way that took a moment for any of us to place. It was too long, too controlled, more like something trying carefully to imitate an animal than an animal actually calling out on its own. We found the source of it eventually, moving slowly through a stand of thin aspens in the fading afternoon light, and it was shaped like an elk, close enough from a distance to pass for one at a glance, except far too large for its species, its shoulders too broad, its legs too long for the body they carried. Its antlers were hung with things that had absolutely no business being anywhere near an animal. A rusted pocket watch, a torn strap that looked to have come from a hiking pack, a single small shoe, a child's shoe, cracked and sun-bleached with age. Once we got close enough to actually listen, really listen, its calls weren't animal sounds at all. They were built out of real human voices, recordings of real people crying out for help, layered together and looped over and over, designed, we all understood without saying it aloud, to draw searchers off the marked trail and out into open, empty ground where nothing could hear them scream back. We never found Walt Priddy. We never even found his gear the way we'd found the missing search teams the year before. Nothing. Not a boot, not a scrap of cloth. Nothing at all, as if the ground itself had simply closed back over wherever he had gone. The sixth case, the one that finally ended my career for good, involved a teenage boy named Colt Ferris, 17 years old, out hunting with his father near that same stretch of ridge on a cold, overcast morning. Owen had brought his son out to that ridge every fall since Colt was old enough to hold a rifle steady, and by every account, including Owen's own, that morning had started exactly like every other morning they'd shared out there, quiet, unremarkable, the two of them walking in comfortable silence with their breath fogging in the cold air. It was Owen who called it in, voice shaking so badly over the radio that Eli had to ask him to repeat himself twice, saying his son had simply stopped walking, turned his head toward a sound coming from somewhere off to their left, and started moving towards it before Owen had even fully registered what direction he was going. Partway through the search that followed his disappearance, we heard that same wrong, looping elk call again, echoing through bare trees stripped down for the coming winter, and this time, every single one of us recognized it immediately for exactly what it was. Colt's father, a broad, quiet man named Owen Ferris, who had hunted that ridge his entire life, told us afterward, sitting wrapped in a wool blanket at the tailgate of our truck, his hands shaking too badly to hold the mug Mara had given him, that his son had walked toward that sound on his own, willingly, without hesitation, like he recognized it as something familiar, something he had heard before and had no fear of at all. Owen said something reached out the dark tree line as Colt approached it and pulled him in without so much as a struggle. No shout, no scuffle in the leaves, nothing at all, the way you'd pull a child through a doorway by the hand. That's the incident I was never supposed to talk about. The one all 7 of us on that search saw together that night, in full view of each other. No confusion among any of us afterward about what we had witnessed, even as the official report tried, in the weeks that followed, to convince us otherwise. I can finally describe it plainly now, after all these years of carrying it in silence. It stood 8 feet tall, easily, towering over even Dax, who was the tallest man on our team. It was thin in a way that looked almost skeletal, its long limbs disproportionate to its narrow frame, its skin cracked and split all over like old dried bark on a dead tree, deep grooves running the length of its arms and down across what should have been its face. It had no eyes at all, just 2 deep black hollows where eyes should have been, hollows that somehow still gave the unmistakable, sickening impression of being looked at, studied, considered, the way you might study an insect you'd already decided wasn't worth stepping on. It made no sound the entire time we stood there, frozen in the dark. No growl, no breath, nothing. And the forest around us had gone utterly silent too. No wind moving through the branches, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Nothing, as though every living thing for a mile in every direction had gone still at the exact same moment we had. Nobody moved. I remember consciously trying to make my own hand reach for the radio clipped to my chest and failing to make it obey me for what felt like an unbearably long time. Owen, standing closest to me, made a small, strangled sound low in his throat, the only noise any of us produced the entire time, and even that seemed to hang too long in the dead air before fading. I watched, from the corner of my eye, one of the younger volunteers on our team slowly, silently begin to cry, without making any sound at all, tears just running down a face gone completely white, too frightened even to sob out loud. It watched all 7 of us in complete silence, for what felt like several unbearable minutes, but was later timed, from Eli's recording of the radio traffic during that stretch, at closer to 40 seconds. 40 seconds. I have never in my life experienced 40 seconds that lasted that long before or since. Then, without any warning, without any change in its posture that I could point to afterward, no matter how many times I replayed it in my mind, it turned, unhurried, almost courteous in the slowness of the movement, and walked backward into the deeper dark of the trees. One long stride and then another, and simply was not there anymore. The way a held breath simply ends, and you realize, all at once, that your chest is aching from how long you'd been holding it. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Owen was the first to move, dropping to his knees in the frozen leaves and calling his son's name into the trees where the thing had gone, his voice cracking apart on the second syllable. And none of us stopped him, though every one of us already understood, in the pit of our stomachs, that no answer was coming. They interviewed each of us alone, in separate rooms, over the following week. A county investigator none of us had ever met before sitting across a folding table, answering the same handful of careful questions again and again. How many hours had we been without proper sleep? How much water had each of us consumed that day? Whether any of us had experienced dizziness, confusion, or disorientation prior to the incident. I answered honestly every single time. Described exactly what I had seen in exactly the same words I've used with you tonight. And every single time I watched the investigator write something down that I was fairly certain didn't match a word I'd actually said. Owen refused to sign his statement at all, and nobody ever pushed him on it, which told me more than anything else that week about how badly certain people wanted this particular story to simply stop moving forward on its own. The official report afterward blamed mass exhaustion and dehydration for what all 7 of us independently and separately described in nearly identical detail during our individual interviews. I quit 3 weeks later and never went back to that station again. Mara handed me her entire lockbox of altered reports the night before I left town for good, pressing it into my hands in the dark outside my truck, like she was passing along something dangerous she could no longer safely carry herself. Eli gave me copies of every recording he'd ever quietly kept without telling a single living soul. A small stack of cassettes wrapped in a plastic bag, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them over. Dax never spoke about that night again. Not once, not even to me, not even years later, over a quiet dinner at his place when I gently tried, one last time, to bring it up between us. He just shook his head slowly and changed the subject, and I never brought it up again after that. Which brings me back to that box on my porch, and the photograph inside it that I have absolutely no memory of anyone ever taking. I finally sat down at my kitchen table one evening with a magnifying glass I'd found in a junk drawer and looked at it properly. Really looked. The way Dax used to teach us to really look at a track before letting ourselves believe what our eyes were telling us. And I realized, with a cold, sinking certainty that settled somewhere low in my stomach, that the tall, thin figure standing between the trees behind my old team in that photograph was not hiding from the camera at all. It was standing in the exact spot, the precise clearing, where Colt Ferris would vanish 5 long years later, long before that disappearance had ever happened, long before Colt Ferris had even been born, as though the whole terrible sequence of events had already been decided somewhere far beyond anything I could see or understand or prevent. I spent the next several nights going back through everything I still had. Mara's old files spread across my kitchen table under a single lamp, just like she used to spread them across hers. The phrase Ren Ashcombe kept repeating all those years ago, which a linguist Mara had quietly consulted off the record, finally managed to translate, decades after the fact, into something close to "the ones who look too long are taken so the rest may stay." Eli's recordings, played one after another late into the night, laid out side by side in one place for the very first time since we'd each gone our separate ways. And somewhere around 3 a.m, sitting alone with all of it spread out in front of me, the house utterly silent except for the tick of the old clock in the hallway, I finally understood the shape of what I had spent 15 years of my life walking through without ever fully seeing. Before I got that far, I called Mara. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 years, not since a mutual friend's funeral, but she picked up on the second ring, like she'd been expecting the call for longer than that. I asked her if she still had a notebook, the private one, the one separate from the lockbox. She went quiet for a moment, and then she asked me if a box had shown up at my house recently. No return address. I didn't answer her right away, and she told me one had shown up at hers 3 weeks earlier, and that she'd been afraid to call me about it. Afraid that saying it out loud to another person would make it more real than she could handle. Her box had contained her own notebook, the one she'd kept locked under that floorboard for over a decade, the one she was certain she still had, until she checked and found the floorboard empty, and the notebook sitting instead on her own kitchen table where the box had been left. Neither of us had an answer for how that was possible. We just sat on the phone together for a long time, not saying much, the way you do with someone who has seen exactly what you've seen and doesn't need it explained to them twice. Those 6 cases, 7 if you count Walt Priddy, the way I've come to over the years, were never random victims. Every single one of them had gotten too close, in the days or weeks before they vanished, to something they were never meant to find. A den, a nesting ground, a trail that led somewhere these things actually lived, hidden in plain sight in country I had walked 1,000 times and never once suspected. The disappearances weren't attacks in the way I had always assumed, senseless and cruel and without reason. They were removals, careful and deliberate, meant to stop anyone else from following that same path even one single step further than the last person had gone. Once I let myself consider that possibility, small memories I had never once questioned at the time started rearranging themselves into something far more unsettling. The time I'd slipped on wet rock above a 200-foot drop and caught myself on a route that, by every account of the terrain, should not have been growing anywhere near that ledge. The night I'd taken a wrong turn on an unfamiliar trail during a whiteout and stumbled, by what I'd always assumed was pure luck, directly onto the one narrow deer path that led safely back to the truck. The dozen small moments across 15 years where danger had brushed right up against me, and then, inexplicably, simply slid past, the way water slides around a stone in a stream without ever quite touching it. I'd spent my whole career believing those moments proved I was good at my job. I no longer believed that, which meant my team and I were never really the hunters in any of this, not for one single day of those 15 years. We were being managed the entire time, quietly, patiently, with a kind of long, careful attention that I still find almost impossible to hold in my mind without my hands starting to shake. Every case that closed cleanly, every person we found alive and unharmed and grateful was allowed to close that way on purpose, because it kept the official story flowing exactly the way it needed to flow for everyone involved, and it kept the rest of us informed just enough to remain useful, and never once close enough to actually find what we were really out there searching for the entire time. The last conversation I ever had with Sheriff Bale happened not long before I left town for good, standing in the gravel lot behind the station on a cold, still evening with nobody else around. He told me something that night I've never once been able to shake since, no matter how many years have passed. He told me I was never in any real danger during those 15 years, not because I was skilled, not because I was careful, not because I made good decisions in bad weather, the way I'd always liked to believe about myself. It was because something out in those woods had been quietly steering danger away from me the entire time. The same gentle, patient way a hand redirects a small child away from stepping into oncoming traffic without the child ever noticing anything had happened at all. I asked him why, my voice barely holding steady. He only said I was useful, exactly where I was, doing exactly what I was doing, and that being useful was the only reason I had ever been allowed to keep going as long as I had. Then he shook my hand. The way you'd shake the hand of someone you respected and was saying a final goodbye to, and walked back inside without another word. So here's the part that keeps me up some nights more than any tall figure standing silent in the trees, more than any pale, massive shape watching from the edge of a ridge, more than any antlers hung with somebody else's belongings, swaying gently in a cold wind. It's the plain, calm, almost bored way Bale said those words to me that night, like he was commenting on nothing more significant than the weather. You were never in danger, Cal. That was the point, not a warning, not a threat, just a simple statement of fact delivered by a man who had clearly known it and lived beside it for far longer than I would ever be able to understand. A few weeks after I retired, on a quiet evening at my own house, far from any wilderness, far from anywhere an elk would ever have a single reason to be, I heard that same long, wrong call outside my window. Just once, drifting in through the screen, on a warm, still night, gone before I could even get fully out of my chair. I stood at the window for a long time afterward, with the lights off, watching the dark yard, and saw nothing at all, though I could not shake the feeling, the same feeling Dax had described to me once over a beer years earlier, of being looked at by something patient and unhurried that had no need to reveal itself unless it wanted to. I drove out to see Dax 3 days after my call with Mara. He's older now, greyer, living alone on a small piece of land with 2 dogs that never once left his side the entire visit, following him room to room like they were guarding him from something only they could sense. I didn't ask him about a box. I didn't have to. The moment I stepped out of my truck, before I'd even said a word, he looked at me from his porch and said, quiet and flat, "You got one too." I nodded. He didn't invite me inside right away. He just stood there for a long moment, looking past me towards the tree line at the edge of his property, and told me he'd stopped sleeping with his windows open the same week his own box arrived, because something had started walking the fence line behind his house at night. Slow, deliberate, never quite close enough to see clearly, but close enough that his dogs wouldn't stop watching that same stretch of darkness until sunrise. We sat on his porch until well after dark that evening, not saying much. 2 old men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in the worst nights of their lives, and neither of us needed to say out loud what we were both thinking, which was that whatever had sent those boxes wasn't finished with either of us yet, and had likely never truly been finished with any of us at all. I still don't know why that box showed up on my porch after all this time. No return address, no note, no explanation of any kind. Just my own old files staring back at me, like they had been waiting patiently for the right moment to be found again. I have my suspicions about who arranged for it to arrive, and I think, if I ever worked up the courage to drive back out to that old county station and ask around, I would find that Sheriff Bale retired the same year I did, and that nobody currently working there has ever met the man in person, only heard his name spoken in the careful, respectful way small towns talk about somebody who used to matter and still somehow does. I don't know what that means. I've decided, for my own peace of mind, not to look too hard for an answer. I tried calling Eli last, later that same week. His number rang through to an automated message saying it was no longer in service, which shouldn't have surprised me, given how many years had passed, except I'd called that same number successfully just 2 months earlier to wish him a happy birthday, the way I did every year without fail. I drove out to the small house he'd rented for as long as I'd known him and found the driveway empty, curtains drawn, a thin layer of undisturbed dust on the porch railing that suggested nobody had come or gone through that front door in a considerable stretch of time. A neighbour, an older woman, watering flowers, 2 houses down, told me she believed he'd moved away suddenly some weeks back, though she couldn't say exactly when, and that she remembered it mostly because she'd never seen a moving truck arrive or leave, only noticed one morning that the house was simply empty, the way you notice a bird has stopped singing outside your window without ever having heard it fly away. I stood in that empty driveway for a long time before I got back in my truck. I've not been able to reach him since, and I've started, against my own better judgment, to wonder whether his box arrived a little earlier than either mine or Mara's or Dax's, and whether he was simply the first of us to finish whatever it is we are all apparently expected to do with what's inside them. What I do believe, sitting here now, is that whoever or whatever arranged for that box to reach me wanted me to remember exactly what I had spent 15 years trying so hard to forget. I always believed I was the one doing the searching out there in those woods, year after year, case after case, carrying a flashlight and a radio, and a stubborn refusal to believe in anything I couldn't put my hands on. I think I finally understand now, sitting here alone in my quiet house telling you all of this out loud, for the first time in my life, that I was never the hunter at all. I was never even entirely the searcher. I was just the one they decided, for reasons I will likely never fully know and may not want to let live long enough to eventually tell you. Some nights, when the wind moves through the trees behind my house in just the wrong way, I still catch myself standing at the back door, hand on the knob, that same old pull tugging gently at the edge of my thoughts. Quieter now than it used to be, but never quite gone. I don't open the door. Not anymore. But I don't turn away from it either. I just stand there listening, the way I spent 15 years learning to listen for the smallest sound that might mean somebody out there still needed to be found. 2 nights ago, long after I'd finished going back through everything in that box for what felt like the 100th time, I finally fell asleep in my chair with the lamp still on, papers still spread across my lap. I woke sometime past 3 in the morning to complete silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any sound, and found the lamp beside me switched off, though I know for certain I never touched it. The photograph, the one that started all of this, was no longer where I'd left it on the table. I found it eventually hours later, in the grey light before dawn, propped carefully against the inside of my own front door, facing outward, as if something had wanted it to be the very first thing I saw on my way out that morning. I haven't touched it since. I don't think I will. And some nights, if I stand at that back door long enough in the dark and the quiet, listening the way I trained myself to listen for 15 years, I swear I can still hear something listening back.